whenever you are ready.
Hello and welcome. I apologize for the delay. My name is Sarah Shaul and I'm the director of 601 Art Space. In conjunction with our current exhibition, Collaborative Survival, we're delighted to present HyperAdaptation, a discursive performance created by Jenny Brockman, one of the artists in this exhibition. Due to safety concerns, tonight's performance is being live streamed, and I'd like to thank both our technical gallery manager, Marie Gay, and filmmaker Lucas Millard for making that possible. We're also happy to be partnering with the German Consulate General New York, who are co-sponsoring this performance, and who you'll be hearing from later in our introductions. If you haven't had a chance to view Collaborative Survival, please visit us at 601 Art Space this weekend, which is the final weekend of the exhibition, between 1 and 6 at 88 Eldridge Street. Next, I'd like to present the exhibition's curator, Danny Shen. Thank you and enjoy the performance. It's right here. I can just go.
Thank you, Sarah. And thank you to the German Consulate General of New York and their wonderful team for generously supporting this event. And also so that artist Jenny Brockman could make it back to New York City from Berlin by way of Croatia, where she was an artist in residence. Thank you to 601 Art Space for everything and for making this exhibition possible. Unfortunately, Yasmin Pamuk, who is the head of cultural affairs and science at the German Consulate General, New York, could not be here with us today, so I will be reading her welcome address on behalf of the German Consulate in her place. Distinguished panel speakers, liebe Danny Shen, Sarah Shaul, and Jenny Brockman. Dear guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the German Consulate General New York, I am delighted to welcome you to HyperAdaptation, a virtual discursive performance organized by German artist Jenny Brockman and US curator Danny Shen, in cooperation with New York-based 601 Art Space Gallery. As the world is undergoing multiple waves of the COVID-19 outbreak, we are experiencing a continued series of global ecological, social, and political crises. There is no doubt about climate change and its negative effects on our planet, as well as the lives of the people living on it. Furthermore, unsettling reports on both sides of the Atlantic highlight how racism and discrimination are far from being defeated. Like in the United States, Germany, and many other countries have been experiencing a resurgence of white supremacist movements and racially motivated violence. Some say this is the quote-unquote new normal of the Anthropocene, which has ceased to be an abstract notion. Nevertheless, how can we make the Anthropocene recognizable without neglecting its complexity? Even more important, how can we meet and tackle the vulnerability and risks its impact causes? The Anthropocene is certainly a formidable challenge, but moreover, it is a proving ground, not only for governments, more so for societies in all their manifestations. These extraordinary times call for substantial ways of making the unique voice of civil society and in particular, art and artists heard again. In times of COVID-19, when public space is confined to remote communication, bringing back these voices and facilitating discourse with a broad and engaged public is more than ever essential. Germany believes that to tackle these challenges, it is essential to make cooperation and exchange an integral part of our foreign policy. Exhibitions like Collaborative Survival, in combination with the discursive performance HyperAdaptation, are great examples, and the German Consulate General New York is delighted to collaborate with partners such as Jenny Brockman, Danny Shen, and 601 Art Space. By provoking thought, events like these empower us to emerge from emergency and to address the global challenges and risks associated with the Anthropocene today. By supporting events like this, our aim is to create synergies at the interface of art, science, and decision-making, where a greater voice of civil society could add value to an inclusive and comprehensive discussion, as well as to better policy decisions. Sitting in front of my computer in my office, I very much look forward to learning more about watching the event and learning more from the excellent panel speakers, Lynn Christensen, Peter Groffman, Lathan Hardy, and Lahuna Ganguly. That was, again, Yasmin Pamuk from the German Consulate General of New York. And this is Danny Shen. I'm the curator of this exhibition, Collaborative Survival at 601 Art Space. So Jenny Brockman and I began conversing several years ago in New York, where she first showed me her work in collaboration with synthetic biologists who were fundamentally challenging our understanding of life itself. And we continued to connect on ideas of finding a common language to interdisciplinarity and its potentials and limits. I'm honored to be able to include Jenny's new body of work, HyperAdaptation, in this exhibition at 601 entitled Collaborative Survival, the exhibition which takes after the term introduced by anthropologist Anna Lowenhaupt-Singh as the way, and I quote, "we change through our collaborations both within and across species, and contamination makes for diversity." Writer Brian Kwan Wood also prompts a further question in his text entitled Insurgency of Life: how might we look towards mutation as a kind of new fiction to inhabit, particularly one that reopens the possibility of change to engineering? As this exhibition poses, how are anthropocentric narratives challenged? One that envisions the human species as lone survivors or saviors of the cosmos in this age of the Anthropocene, defined by explosive climate change and shifting, complex, and messy environments. This event, which is unfolding, is an activation of the artist installation behind me and around me, composing of Archive of a Future Memory, #2, HyperAdaptation, and 2020-2002 HyperAdaptation. Jenny Brockman, to give a little context, has exhibited internationally in solo and group exhibitions, including Menage, St. Petersburg, Museo de Arte de El Salvador, San Salvador, Nordart, Rendsburg, St. Pancras, London, Gallery Gherkin and Haus am Lutzplatz, Berlin, Kaohsiung Museum of Fine Arts in Taiwan, Hudson Valley Center for Contemporary Art in Peekskill, 1014, New York, Beaux-Arts, Brussels, to name a few. Characterized by a discursive aesthetics, her works serve as instructive models for her artistic research. Jenny's interactive installations further provoke questions and conversations around human behavioral patterns and social structures. Her process also examines the constructed divisions of nature and culture, as well as the empirical bounds of scientific knowledge production by creating an interdisciplinary space within the gallery. Here in collaboration with New York-based researchers Lynn Christensen, Peter Groffman, Lathan Hardy, and Lahuna Ganguly, who will be speaking shortly. From the perspective of their distinct fields of practice, each will address shared topics in the face of Anthropocene discourse on adaptability, non-adaptability, and resilience across species, environments, social interactions to artificial intelligence. As writer Roy Scranton wrote in Learning How to Die in the Anthropocene, Reflections on the End of a Civilization, in order for us to adapt to this strange new world called the Anthropocene, we're going to need more than scientific reports and military policy. We're going to need new ideas. We're going to need new myths and new stories, a new conceptual understanding of reality, and a new relationship to the deep polyglot traditions of human culture that carbon-based capitalism has vitiated through commodification and assimilation. Though these next talks will be given in the isolation of this gallery, trust that the conversations have been occurring through long-term relations between each of us and the artist, as also illustrated by the cartography behind me. In times of global pandemic, we continue to adapt to mirror the times and create a new kind of situation in virtual program, and in the spirit of Jenny Brockman's work, an experiment, one that also considers care and connectedness. To close, this discursive performance, as coined by Jenny, will work like a chamber play and has already begun. All of the participants are waiting outside the gallery at the moment in order to keep distance from each other, and will come in and make their contribution and then leave the room of the gallery again. The time delay between the contributions is congruent to the way the participants take to cross the gallery space. The room, the objects in the room, the drawing, and you as the audience will then connect these talks together and create a bigger picture.
So, thank you so much, Danny, for inviting me to this exciting exhibition project. And thank you, David, Sarah, and the gallery team for your amazing work and support. Thank you, Jasmine, from German Consulate for the generous funding of my project, and thank you, Lucas, for the filming. Thank you to all for participants with whom I had the pleasure to be in conversation over the last year, and who gave me the opportunity to have insights in their research practice. The media, so hyperadaptation means on the one hand an over-adaptation to a system surrounding the subject, and on the other hand, it is an overtaking of already existing knowledge and standards through imagination and creative thinking and acting. Political theorist Hannah Arendt wrote, "There are no dangerous thoughts. Thinking itself is dangerous." And this performance might become an exercise in dangerous thinking. The media used relate to the overgrowth or merging of nature and culture with technologies and the forming of a new nature, the cyborg nature, relating to Donna Haraway's Cyborg. Biology. Biological processes in nature are per se adaptive processes. Evolution can only take place as hyperadaptation. The habitat of animals and humans is in a constant adaptive conflict. Respectively, humans often occupy space to such an extent that nature has to retreat. But where humans abandon space, nature poetically reclaims its space. Due to natural processes or the interference by us humans, alterations are taking place, where species are disappearing and others are spreading in excess. Rachel Carson described in her book that the changes, in her case, the death of insects from agricultural chemicals, are also audible. Quote, over increasingly large areas, spring now comes unheralded by the return of the birds, and the early mornings are strangely silent where once they were filled with the beauty of birdsong. The balance of nature is not a status quo, it is fluid, ever shifting. In a constant state of adjustment, man too is part of this balance. Dear Lynn Christensen, you are professor at Vassar College, an ecosystem ecologist with a special interest in how animals, plants, and soils interact with each other. This area of studies follow the processing of important nutrient elements like nitrogen from the soils of plants and animals and back it again, and reveal adaptation in action. My questions for you are, how does your work relate to collaborative survival? And thinking about our conversations we had over the past 2 years, how does it relate to hyperadaptation? Music. In music, various forms of hyperadaptation take place. On the one hand, new technologies are available to the musician, to which he, she adapts and which he, she uses. And on the other hand, technology is used to develop new instruments according to the requirements of the musician's creative work. An exemplary place of adaptation in the sense of tuning to each other is improvisation in music. What is special about improvisation is that it produces non-repeatable pieces, consists of free performance, and is characterized by immediacy and dialogue. Jazz musician Stephen Lacy once said, for 10 seconds of composition, you have all the time of the world. For 10 seconds of improvisation, exactly 10 seconds. Dear Lathan, you are a Brooklyn-based composer, sound designer, specializing in woodwind and synthesizer performance, and you have performed all over the world as a soloist and with ensembles including Solange, Saint-Lucs, Billy, 10th Intervention, and Holy Hand Granite. Allowing music to have its own rules per artistic relationships or performance venues is the main concept that unites all of your works and collaborations. Music is mainly listening is one of your favorite quotes. What means hyperadaptation to you? And what has this all to do with meditation? Chemistry. In chemistry, a main research topic are those substances that make up the earth and the air, and which gases are absorbed by the earth from the air. From the dynamics of absorption and repulsion, it can be read here how processes function on a global level. In the forest, a hyperadaptation takes place by changing metabolism. Methane is emitted by agricultural use of the earth. Climate change, termed a hyper-object by dark ecology author Timothy Morton, creates a wetter environment for forest soils. And because wetter soils absorb less methane, this gas remains in the air, contributing to further climate change. The metabolism of the forest is thus permanently altered. The fact that the gas is invisible has a strange analogy to the fact that the effects of climate change are so great but so elusive to us humans. Humans are the creatures that are able to transcend evolution and are extremely adaptable to the environment through technological innovation. Dear Peter, you are a professor at the CUNY University of New York, Advanced Science Research Center at the Graduate Center, and a senior research fellow at the Carey Institute of Ecosystem Studies. You study urban ecosystems as a focal point to understand relationships between the realms of nature and culture. How does hyperadaptation take place in nature, and what has culture to do with it? Media theory. Media theory examines, among other things, how the reception of television and online formats works. A very prominent global TV format is the show Indian, German, or British Idol. Here, a hyper-adaptation to the demands of the audience takes place. The supposedly real is artificially created by the performance of the characters shown. In television, a multi-perspectivity seems often too complicated for mainstream audiences. This results in disentangled relationships that are supported by the physical limitations of the screen. In her widely acclaimed speech, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie warns against preferring the single story to multi-perspectivity, quote, "The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they aren't true, but they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. It is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. The consequence of the single story is this, it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. When we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise." Dear Lohona, you are a media scholar and researcher. Your work on television studies, global media industries, cultural globalization, and international communication has been published in academic journals and edited volumes on global media and international political economy. You teach at the School of Media Studies, the New School, New York, and have previously worked in the television industry in the United States and India. My questions for you are, how do you relate to the topic of hyperadaptation? How does the screen medium shape the content shown, and how does it affect the audience? What is truth and what representation?
Hello, and thanks, Jenny, for the invitation to be able to reflect on our conversations that we've talked about over the past few years, and especially in this past pandemic year, especially when we think about collaborative survival. We've survived to this point, and your show is here, and I'm very happy to be a part of it. As you introduced me, you said that I was an ecosystem ecologist, and we've had wonderful conversations, and I thoroughly enjoy the ability to speak with artists and others who study the world in a different way than I do. As an ecosystem ecologist, your title of this exhibition, Collaborative Survival, really resonates when we think about our environment around us. How do species live with one another? How do they help facilitate the existence of one species to another species? As an ecologist, I think a lot about how these species are related, and there's areas of ecology that follows successional trajectories. And we can think about the mirrors of that in our own human societies. And so when we think about ecology and succession and these transitions, oftentimes species will provide opportunities for other species in this facilitation. They make something available for the next group of organisms. And so the title of this exhibit, this collaborative survival, really resonates as an ecologist and how we as human beings might think about not only the natural world around us, but our own built world. And I'd really like to move now a little bit thinking about your title of hyperadaptation. I found it very fascinating to think about hyperadaptation, especially in our rapidly changing world. Again, as an ecologist, we oftentimes think about what adaptation is. Adaptation that's part of our evolutionary processes. So the world is continually changing. And in that changing world, organisms must adapt or not survive. And so perhaps hearkening back to the title of collaboration, these organisms can survive in a space if we give them opportunities. I know that one of the topics that we talked about previously, thinking about hyperadaptation, you pressed me and asked me for a couple of examples of organisms that I might describe as being hyperadapted, especially in this changing world. I study climate change. I study how winter climate change especially might be modifying organisms that I am interested in. And one of the organisms I'm interested in very much are very large ungulates. These are big herbivores who eat a lot of trees in our northern woods, our moose. And moose are very near and dear to me. I study them in New Hampshire especially. And we spoke a lot about how changes in the environment might change this organism's survival and how they might be hyperadapted to the environment. From my perspective, they're actually not hyperadapted to their environment, but another organism that is having a major impact on their survival is hyperadapted. These are winter ticks. And winter ticks are an organism who is really benefiting from the changes or modifications in our climate, in our environment, and especially how much snow we get. So we have these really interesting links between species that are oftentimes obscure to us or unknown to us until we start to investigate them. And one of the things we spoke about is these winter ticks become very densely populated. Many of them survive because of our changing climate conditions. And they drop off after they've fed on an animal, they take a blood meal, and they drop off into the bare soil of the forest floor. Typically, in our environment, we would have seen snow on that forest floor when they dropped off. But in our changing environment, that snow is now melting earlier and earlier and earlier. It means there's this wonderful survival for ticks, which means that's great for ticks. So there's a species who is really benefiting from these changes. But that's not so great for our moose. And more ticks means it's getting tougher and tougher and tougher for those moose to survive. So that was one of the examples we spoke about an organism who maybe is not hyperadapted to these changes in our environment, and perhaps we're seeing a decline in their ability to survive, but we're seeing another organism come in and be able to take advantage of those conditions, these winter ticks. Another species we talked about that really thinks about its ability to survive in its relationship with its environment is poison ivy. I don't know if many of you are familiar with this plant. I am very familiar. I break out in a distinct rash when I encounter poison ivy. It is doing very, very well in our environment. It really takes off and grows very rapidly especially with increased levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. One of the changes that we see in our climate are directly related to this increased level of CO2 in our environment. And so poison ivy is able to capitalize on that. That's its carbon source. It's able to grow very rapidly. But there's one more special adaptation that this plant has that makes it hyper-adapted to do so well and survive so prolifically in our environment. And that's that it produces these wonderful berries, and birds love these berries. And if you think about how some organisms might disperse and survive in different spaces and places, it's getting to that place that's really challenging. And so poison ivy puts out these wonderful berries in the fall, and birds eat them, and they fly great distances and deposit them after they've ingested them and digested what they can, and they excrete what they can't. And those seeds are intact, and those seeds are well adapted to being transported great distances by these birds. So those are two examples of organisms that are hyper-adapted to our changing environmental conditions, and how that survival has increased in some, but may decrease in others. And I suppose one of the things that we've talked a little bit about, and especially last week, when we think about our human-built environment and all the species that we share our space with, that's an important thing for us to remember. We share our space. If we can give other organisms some space so that they too can interact with us or with others and with their environment, they have a chance to survive. So sometimes it seems like our biodiversity loss is increasing, and that many, many species won't survive. But we as people have the opportunity and the option and the wherewithal to actually make choices and to be aware of the other organisms that are surrounding us. So we have the ability in our own efforts, in our own collaborations with each other, but with the environment, to actually have more species survive than we're currently seeing in the dramatic loss of species. So thank you.
My name is Lathan Hardy, and I am a musician, a woodwind player, just a lover of all music. And during these times of HyperAdaptation, thoughts that have come to me have been, how can we look at things in a new light? And what is that action of looking at things in a new light? And for me, what I've been learning is it's learning how to be present and how to actually be there. And so, and some of what I want to do for today is just kind of show you these techniques that I have to heal, and then also show you these techniques I have to listen. And so at first, what I'm going to do is just kind of play what I call long tones. And these long tones sound very simple, but they help you learn how to just listen and not judge or define what you're listening to. So I'm going to play, let's say, 4 long tones, and we're going to listen. piece of advice that I have and would love to share is that if anyone wants to be able to calm themselves and learn how to listen to their emotions and learn how to listen to the world around them, just to get used to listening to one pitch is one of the best ways to start doing that. And also, so now what I'm going to do, just as like maybe a demonstration of showing how I can listen to the room and listen, is just listen to the room, and I'm going to play for the next, I don't know, 5 or 10 minutes. Thank you. In conclusion, like, music is this hyper-adaptivity that I seek into it, is the ability to let go and the ability to not be based in fears with my actions. And music is the anecdotal actions of that, but that leads into the rest of my life to try to actually have actions that are based on the moment instead of my past. Thank you. I love that. I forgot about my flute.
I'm absolutely delighted to be here participating in this event to talk about hyperadaptation. And adaptation, the ability of organisms to adapt to environmental conditions, is long established, and it's an old area of study. And not only do organisms have the ability to adapt to the environment, but organisms have the ability to affect the environment and create environments that make the world a better place for these organisms. And my favorite example of this is the why do we have oxygen in the atmosphere? And this is an old story. If you go back 4 billion years to the primordial soup, the first life emerged from the primordial soup 4 billion years ago. And they figured out some way to live by capturing energy from the sun. And they captured energy from the sun, and part of that process was to split the water atom, and that released oxygen. And so the oxygen then filled the atmosphere. And so this was an example of organisms adapting to the conditions. They figured out how to capture energy from the sun, but then they produced oxygen, which changed everything on the Earth. As oxygen filled the atmosphere, it moved up into the stratosphere and formed ozone. And the ozone protected organisms from ultraviolet radiation. And it allowed organisms to emerge from the sea and to live on the land. And it allowed organisms to capture energy much more efficiently from the compounds, the organic compounds and the inorganic compounds in the rocks. And so there really shouldn't be any oxygen in the atmosphere. If we treat the Earth as a geochemical system, there really shouldn't be any oxygen in the atmosphere. And the emergence of oxygen in the atmosphere caused us to realize that what we really have on the Earth is not a geochemical system, but a biogeochemical system, where the biology is interacting with the geochemistry to create the world that's around us and in a constant state of adaptation. Now, interest in these biogeochemical processes increased greatly as the human impact on the planet increased over the last 100 years or so. Humans make a lot of waste, and the organisms on the planet showed incredible ability to adapt to that waste. We release toxic compounds into the environment, and the organisms are able to eat them and render them not as toxic. In 2010, we dumped millions and millions of gallons of oil into the pond. Now, where did it go? It was eaten by organisms that were cleaning up our wastes. And we have, over the last 100 years or so, we have dug up lots of fossil fuel carbon and burned it and put tremendous amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But a lot of the carbon dioxide that we put into the atmosphere was absorbed by organisms in the ocean, by the trees that grow on the land, and a very high percentage of the carbon dioxide that we have released has been absorbed by organisms adapting to this change, this environmental change. And so what we've come to realize is that not only do we not have a geochemical system, not only do we not have a biogeochemical system, but we now realize that we have a bio-geo-sociochemical system because the human imprint on the planet is so large and the interactions between humans and the other organisms on the system are so profound that we now feel that we are dealing with a bio-geo-sociochemical system. Another useful term for describing this change is the idea of the Anthropocene, which reflects the idea that in that long 4 billion year history of the Earth, that we have now entered an age where humans' impact on the planet is so wide. So the emergence of the Anthropocene raises a lot of research questions, both in biogeochemistry and in biogeosociochemistry. And one of my research questions, Jenny introduced it and is described in the exhibit here, is I study the ability of bacteria that live in the soil to take methane out of the atmosphere. Now, methane is a very potent greenhouse gas. It's produced naturally in wetlands. They call it swamp gas, but it's also called natural gas, which is a fuel that humans use. We use tremendous amounts of natural gas, and we release lots of it into the environment. Concentration of this greenhouse gas in the atmosphere has risen alarmingly over the last 50 years or so, but would have risen a lot more if we didn't have these bacteria in the soil that had the ability to eat methane and pull methane out of the atmosphere. And the higher the concentration of methane goes in the atmosphere, the more the organisms eat that methane. And that's a great example of adaptation. But in our research, we are concerned about the limits to that adaptation. And this is a big question in biogeochemistry now, is how long will the trees be able to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? How long will the oceans be able to absorb carbon dioxide? How much oil can we dump into the Gulf of Mexico before the ability to degrade it is exceeded? And with our methane question, we have evidence that the ability of soils to pull methane out of the atmosphere is decreasing. And we think it's because of climate change. It rains more, the soils are wetter. And when the soils are wet, it's harder for the bacteria to get access to the methane in the atmosphere. And so it's an example, and we have been measuring this for 20 years. We, at several sites in the eastern US, we go out every month and we measure the ability of soils to pull methane out of the atmosphere. And over the last 25 years, it's been going down. And so that's a good example of a biogeochemical research question, very central on hyperadaptation. But some of the really hardest questions are in the biogeosociochemical realm, where how do we get people to come to grips with these complex changes and to propose and implement solutions to these changes? And that is why we get very excited about working with artists. It's why I'm delighted to be here today. Because scientists are not so great at getting people to grapple with the complexities of problems and to propose and implement solutions. And many areas of science struggle with this, whether it's climate change or nutrition or vaccines, we struggle with this. And yet we are in awe of artists who have the ability to convey complex context and complex phenomenon in compelling ways. And there's been a movement over the last 10 or 15 years or so of collaborations between art and science to, again, help people to grapple with the complexities of our changing world and to propose and implement solutions to them. I'm very proud to be part of that movement. I think our exhibit here today is just a great example of that. And I look forward to many more collaborations in the future.
everyone. I am so honored and so glad to be here as part of this amazing and stimulating conversation. I've been looking forward to this. And I'm sorry I'm not there in person interacting with all of you in the room, but that's the world we live in. And that's kind of the topic of the conversation today and this amazing installation and presentation by Jenny, isn't it? That despite this pandemic, despite the kind of disruptions that it introduces in our lives, we are here. I cannot see you, I do not know you, but here I am via media engaging in this conversation on hyper-adaptation and how adaptation allows us to survive collaboratively. And as a media scholar and a cultural studies scholar, adaptation is at the heart of all I do, and that really is a question that media scholars engage with inevitably, whether we're talking about individual adaptations, how we try to fit in the frame of the camera, how we try to fit in with our lives into our cell phones and all the other multimedia technologies that we use today, or collectively, how societies adapt to the historical changes and to each other. And part of adaptation for me as a social scientist is also a question of what is included and what is excluded, right? So if the question is of what is hyperadaptation, then for me that takes me straight away to who is adapting, towards what, under what conditions, for whom, and why. So as a social question, I think that is where it takes us immediately. Now, adaptation is also a process, and so it is futile in some ways, and I would argue impossible, to talk in very finite terms. And as media scholars, we look at media in terms of the production, the distribution, and the consumption. And the product, the media product, the final product, the book we are reading, and whatever we are talking about, the product is often at the center of it. And yet it is the processes that makes that product, which is central as well. And that's really what we study, what we explore. And that inevitably, again, takes us to the question of adaptation. And so for me, I'm always skeptical of talking about adaptation with any sense of finality. And as social scientists, natural scientists have their own ways of going about it, but as social scientists, we are dealing with a world of infinite social variables. So how do we study them? There's no pause button, there's no stop. So to study processes and processes of adaptation is methodologically quite challenging, right? There's no way to stop the world and study it and then come up with a theory. By the time we're coming up with a theory, the world is adapted. The social variables have interacted, mutated, and changed. So adaptation is a very intriguing, challenging concept for us and always at the center of what we do. So I think, to get to the notion of adaptation, and I am entering this conversation from the point of view of a cultural adaptation and socio-historical adaptations. And the notion of hyper, for instance, is in our common parlance would be identified with an intensity, an acceleration of forces. And that's true, but it also then takes us to some kind of a teleological argument that there is a design, there is an order, there's a hierarchy, and hence that hyper and minor, the meta and the meso and the micro levels. And for me, that is a problematic concept. So I'm trying to problematize the word hyper here. not as a discrete concept, but as an essentially a relative one. Hyper to what? And only that relative understanding is what gives us meaning, what lends the notion of hyper relative meaningful. So I think what I'm getting at again in the question of hyperadaptation as a social researcher is that we are so intertwined and enmeshed today, and more so than ever, perhaps, and that's where the acceleration question and the globalization question comes in. But our human condition is so intertwined, and we are constantly, inescapably adapting to it. If we think about what's going on today, the global climate change report, the global pandemic, and the global inequity and economic injustice, racial injustice, gender inequity that we inhabit, that those are the challenges we have in front of us today. And all of those are, while fields of action and understanding and policy making, are also intertwined. And each is interconnected to the other, and the infinite social variables that makes for these challenges makes it interesting for us scholars or researchers to understand where to begin in the processes that are taking place here in terms of hyperadaptation. So I think hyperadaptation is inevitable, inescapable, and it forces us to look at the processes rather than the product, forces us to look at how things are happening before we can talk about where do we want to go from here. So that is also where my work as a researcher comes in terms of the other question that we can think about here that I was asked was a question of screen and media, and how does the medium shape the messages or the audience, or how it impacts audiences. And there are kind of the short answer to it is to go back to Marshall McLuhan, who said the medium is the message. So as the medium changes, the messaging changes. But we need to focus on the medium, the technologies of broadcasting, of telecommunicating. The technologies and the medium is what we need to look at. That's an argument, but that's an argument that came up in a historical time where competing theories from the political economic analysis of media and how media impacts audiences was also coming up with the theory that those who control or own the means of production, those who control technology, will decide what to produce, what to circulate, what messages to circulate. And that inevitably decides how audiences understand the world, what kind of worldviews and ideological mindsets we inherit and we learn. So there are competing theories in terms of how media impacts audiences. But I think for me, the question is in itself kind of, again, a question of adaptation, because medium is the message allows us to think in terms of the media and the message as discrete, different entities. And yet they are not anymore, or they are decreasingly so, right? Like today, we are in a multimedia digital environment where our voices can activate media, right? Our voices activate artificial intelligence, Siri, or you can go on with it. And those are just the visible manifestations of artificial intelligence and kind of seamless, intuitive technology that we are aware of. But AI is already, artificial intelligence is already part of our lives. And increasingly what we do find is we're not just holding a remote and pressing buttons actively, but it's media is activated by our voices, by our glances, by our faces, our face recognition technologies. So our bodies are being incorporated and listed into the world of technology. And that takes us into another realm of trying to explore how does that impact our ability as sentient, conscious beings, not just intelligent beings, to understand and explore the distinctions and the adaptive processes there. So I think there are numerous questions, obviously, we can ask about it, but about the emerging technologies. But one of the critical questions for me in terms of adaptation and survival and collaborative survival, not just as discrete individuals, is to understand where are the boundaries, who controls it, what are the terms and conditions under which I participate and under which I cannot participate. And that's again something that has been brought up and made so visible and accessible to us during this pandemic, where we have shifted our lives online. But again, some of us can do that, some of us cannot. The vast majority of us cannot. And I think that's another point that I want to emphasize here in terms of the media and the audience engagement and audience reception and meaning-making processes is that when we talk about media, there are different formats, there are different platforms, there are different vehicles and devices. And there is a tendency for us, based on where we are situated, and this is New York City, and most of us are in this industrialized, capitalized world of online technologies, but there are more people off the grid than those who are on this online grid. There are more people who do not have smartphones than those who do have smartphones. There are people, students, children in New York City who do not have access to online technologies to access school during a pandemic. And that's New York City we are talking about, right? So there's an inclination, it's tempting for us in media studies to kind of get engaged with the what's new, what's different, and AI and all these technologies are alluring in that sense. They are. And yet, we live in a world which is inevitably, inescapably interconnected. And we have to think about the digital divide. We have to think about how people who are online and who are offline, who are on media, who are on different medias, whether that's community radio services or the humdrum television, on a television, not on your smartphone, not on your laptop, how are the different mediated worlds connected? And what separates them? Where are the fault lines? So again, this pandemic brings out that human condition of connection and yet disconnection very sharply and poignantly for us in media studies, but for us, all of us really. And that is something that media scholars have grappled with, whether it's a question of the structural, political, economic understanding of who owns media, who is producing the content, what are the power relationships, therefore, who is there for the consumer, and what kind of media messages are being produced. Or that is a question of how do we, as independent agents, as individuals with the ability to think rationally and act on our wills, can co-opt and can change the intended purposes. So we are adapting in a way that can lead us to a very different path than anticipated, right? I mean, Social media is fostering social alienation. Social media has all these different issues that we talked about as serious social concerns. And yet social media can spark revolutions. TikTok may be not the most philosophical, intellectual space that one imagines, and yet ecofeminists and financial feminists are really reinventing the conversation around feminism and in a capitalist economy on TikTok. And so many other conversations that are so progressive, so front and center in the social conversation around equity and justice, right, that are taking place on these platforms. And that kind of brings us to the vastness of the space here and how all the different infinite social variables are connected, and there is so much to explore on that. The question of truth and reflections and representations, that's a very complex question. And that again, I mean, I understand the need to grapple with it, and that's been part of the human condition in terms of, you know, Plato's cave of exploring the illusions, or the Vedic Advaita philosophies of Maya, as all the empirical world is a representation. Now, how do you get to truth? You have to engage with the empirics of the world, the material world. And that essentially becomes a representation. So what is truth? I do not know. I would not, hazard a guess there. But as a social scientist, as a media scholar, I know that we have competing truths. We have different truths. Your truth versus my truth, as well as the possibility that your truth and my truth can coexist, which takes us to a whole open space of collaborative survival, which takes us to a space of adaptation and hyper-adaptation. And as a media scholar, you know, my work has focused on global media and global television. And I find it interesting to look at popular culture and understand, how does that inform us about the world? How does that help us in terms of surviving in an ever-changing, evolving global economy? And so my research looks at reality TV shows, which, not the most intellectual exercise perhaps that we think in terms of producing or participating in reality TV shows. But we know that there's a long cultural studies history of looking at popular media as a space that helps acculturate us, that helps us understand and explore how to live in this world, how to adapt to this world. And when I look at reality TV formats and how they are sold across the world and remade and localized, culturally indigenized in different cultural television markets around the world, the question for me, again, is power relationships. So if we have looked at adaptation from a structural, political, economic sense of how those who control media production control the production of messages, the content will control how audiences think. I, in my work, problematize that question in two ways. One is methodologically, where we understand the processes can we understand the hot words and the meaning-making processes that go into producing a media product without digging deep and jumping into the fray of the production processes. So a structural economic perspective in media looks at the the capital ownership patterns, the capital flows, who owns, who doesn't own. And cultural studies would look at the media text, a media analysis. So what does this media represent? And for me, I like to bridge the two worlds of cultural studies and international political economy methodologically by conducting production ethnography. So getting into the filming studios, getting into the editing studios, getting into conversations in corporate meetings and with creative teams as they are making these reality TV shows and figuring out, well, how do I take a show like Pop Idol, which began in UK, became a global success due to its success in US market as American Idol. How do we take that show and make it successful in India? A completely different culture, right? With a very different market realities and industrial realities. And that creative process and the madness and the improvisations and the adaptations that come from the creative team, and how that aligns itself or disrupts the larger structural logics and the political economic logics is what I would explore. And at the same time, how it enlists us, how we participate in that, whether as active, as aspiring participants or as audiences. And for me, I can share one quick anecdote that has always been very meaningful for me. I met this young man from a village in Rajasthan in India when I was conducting my research. And he comes from a Mangyar tribe that they sing, they're professional singers, and their folk songs are beautiful desert songs. And he was a participant doing very well on Indian Idol. And I was talking with him and he said, Didi, and addressing me as a sister, as when we are born, we say our babies don't cry, they sing at the moment of birth. We are born with the talent of singing. But here on the Indian Idol and the Idol format stage, I have to learn how to sing professionally the way they think professional singers sing, which is standing at a microphone, holding the microphone in a particular way, with a multi-camera, multi-light setup designed stage, and a live shoot with producers giving you footwork and cues. So that professionalization, which is essential in determining who is a good singer, who can succeed on the Idol stage, who can appeal to the audiences and get more votes on Indian Idol. That professionalization is an adaptation process he is learning and trying to survive in that game. So how does that core of idea of knowing how to sing as a baby, how music being such a primal and integral aspect of one's life gets adapted into the professionalized, industrialized cultural production? How do these creative processes adapt to the market needs, to the advertisers' needs, to the capital needs? And how does that creative process unfold around the world as global television formats have proven to be the most lucrative part of global television in some ways today? And that creative adaptive processes cannot be understood sitting and researching, just looking at data, or in one's office. We have to dive into that ethnographic documentary of everyday lives and everyday moments and gestures and collaborations that take place. And all of that is a part of that adaptive process that we engage in, whether we want to or we don't. We are engaging at this very moment, just like he did, in kind of adapting and making this conversation happen, despite all the disruptions that this pandemic has brought to us, despite the distances between us, the physical and the temporal distances, the social distances. We inhabit, I do not know you, and I do not know your context, and whether you're watching this on your phone or on the laptop, in your bed, in your PJs, or in the living room, or on the bus, on the subway. But here we are in this moment, right? And we are adapting to it, we are collaborating around it. And that moment of unity also brings into sharp focus the differences that we have in our social worlds. And I think for me, that question of adaptation and collaboration and survival is very much a question of under what terms, for whom, who is adapting, what is the impulse there, motivating impulse, and what is the motor, what keeps it going. So the question of power relationships is very much central to this question of hyperadaptation and survival and collaboration for me. Thank you.